see
Nancy
us,
has said yes.
that they can see us and
Yes.
hear us, so that's
And-
great, so.
And I'm going to try one more. There you go.
Assuming that we're live tonight.
There you are, Tom. That's as good as I can get you right
That-
now. Is
that
that good enough?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Serenoa chapter of the Florida Plant Society. We get to meet here at Selby. We've had a few technical difficulties tonight getting the program to work. With the hybrid meetings, with the Zoom and in person, it's a little challenging, but we're working out the bugs still. So it's working very well. Selby's a great place to meet here with beautiful sunset tonight, beautiful night, great rain yesterday. Everything's got a good soaking, so we're very fortunate to be here right now. We have a great program tonight, but before we get started, let's see, we meet through May. Our May meeting, we're gonna have some landscapes on tour, which will be nice. We also have in our April meeting, we have the slate of officers for the next year's board is presented in April. And then the May meeting, we have our general election. So if anybody wants to nominate anybody for any of the positions on the board, we got a good board now. We have like 13 people on the board. So we really have a nice board. We have good meetings. All the meetings are done in Zoom. Periodically, we'll have one in person. But it's we're developing a really good board. So if anybody wants to be on the board, all the meetings are open. We meet on the first Tuesday of the month. So, and then the meetings on the third, general meetings on the third Monday of the month. So if anybody wants to join the board, we welcome you. Our field trip is this Saturday. The field trips were starting at 10 o'clock. So just of note, we are going to start them at 9. We want to give everybody a little more time to meet at the to experience outside, right on hand. So 9 to noon are the meetings, and then bring a lunch. Usually there's time after the field trips to socialize a little bit and sit and have lunch. We go to some really cool places. This Saturday it's out at Waaka Park, so that'll be a really nice one out there. And then also too, the one in March is Tiger Creek, right? Tiger Creek Preserve, which is out toward Lake Wales. So it's a little further of a drive, but it's a really beautiful area out there. It's part of the Nature Conservancy. It's really pretty property out there, Tiger Creek Preserve. We did have one announcement. There's a field trip, Selby-led field trip down at Spanish Point. You want to just mention?
Well, actually, I have some wonderful volunteer opportunity for you. I think David Turner, I do a tour here in Selby Gardens. And last year we started a native plant tour at Spanish Point. And this is something that Liz and Stephen helped me work on, and it's about 40 plants. We're looking for volunteers who would like to escort sort of visitors around. It's about a 1-hour tour, and it deals with fairly ordinary plants. But because Spanish Point isn't sort of a historical place, it's kind of a historical tour. And we're dealing with native plants that had some connection to indigenous people, and they used them for medicine, food, forage, pioneers within the 19th century. So this is something that's appealing to, and actually it's very easy. We give you training, you have a script, and most of the plants are fairly common. Just things like, like beautyberry and coffee and stranded fish. But these plants, even though they're very common, they're very important for indigenous people, and very important. So that's something which appeals to you, and you could have a lot of flexibility for mornings or the afternoon, where it takes about an hour. And and I've been doing this for 2 months, people are very excited about this tour. It's a good way to share your knowledge and make people excited about it. So I hope you'll all consider it. And I'm going to leave the whole sign up book on the table over there. If you're interested, we'll contact you and we can talk about it.
So that's the volunteer opportunity at Spanish Point. And when's the date on that?
Well, it's ongoing.
It's an ongoing, so it's a sign up.
We have 2 guides now. We'd like to get more guides. Maybe like do one every day. This is something, you can be very flexible about this. with this.
So if you're zooming in, you could, just put a message in the chat, your email address, and, we can contact you there.
We'll contact you and let you know when there's training, if you have any questions, certainly love to have it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Does anybody else have any announcements? Okay, well, let's get right into our program. So we have Kenny Coogan tonight, and he's a carnivorous plant specialist, grower, teacher, propagator. I'm just gonna go ahead and let you introduce yourself, Kenny.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I wrote this book about 2 years ago. It's called Florida's Carnivorous Plants. And I actually wrote it during the pandemic, but there was no paper for colored books during the pandemic. So it was delayed for about a year. So it's just published, not this fall, but the fall before. So all of the photos and diagrams and maps you're going to see in the presentation are found in the book.
And what do we have on the screen? Looks good. I'm just trying to get this to be coherent with it. Not as lucky. There we go. I can not see why it's doing what it's doing.
We got here at 5 o'clock. She put this right.
And it's,
It's
try that. There we go.
fun and team.
Okay, there you go. And here she.
Perfect. Thank you. Let's see. All right. Today we're going to be talking about carnivores. Yay, very good. Going to talk about organisms that have sharp incisors, toxins, and really strong grasping power, but we're not talking about animals. We're going to be talking about plants, and plants have all of the same adaptations that animals do. Unfortunately, there's no carnivorous plant that's large enough to eat a human. It's only in the movies. The largest ones, and I did bring some really large specimens, they can eat 1 to 3 mice a year. It has been documented in the past 20 years, like 2 songbirds, but these plants over there from Asia and the songbirds that were eaten, it happened in a carnivorous plant nursery, definitely in Germany and somewhere else in Europe. So it doesn't really happen because that's not what they're attracting. There are around 900 species of carnivorous plants all over the world. They're everywhere except for Antarctica. Of them use their flowers to trap and kill their prey. All of them use modified leaves. So if you look all the way to the left, we have the North American pitcher plant. And if you look closely, you'll see that some of their pitchers are not opened. And that's because in the springtime, they flower, usually January through March. And before they are pollinated, they'll send up these fake pitchers. And they're getting pollinated. Then after they're done being pollinated, they open up their pitchers and they eat the very organisms that had helped them out a few weeks ago. And then, let's see, in the picture in the center, what we were showing you was a butterwort, which are native to Florida. And those and Venus flytraps, they separate their prey from their pollinators by distance. So what they're eating are tiny little things that are crawling around on the ground. And there we go. And what they're being pollinated by are flying insects. So they have their traps open and they have their flowers at the same time. This is a page in my book. It shows you all of the different organisms that Florida's carnivorous plants eat. And they're eating tiny things like rotifers, protozoa, ants, wasps. And somebody always asks, do they eat mosquitoes? And the answer is no. There's about 900 species of carnivorous plants, and almost none of them are interested in mosquitoes. So all of them are using color and scent to attract their prey. And mosquitoes are not interested in that. Or the ones that are biting us are not interested in that. The ones that bite us won't let. So carnivorous plants will not be eating your mosquitoes. In the book, I write about 34 species that you can have historically found in the state of Florida. One of them is now extirpated, which means it's extinct in the state of Florida. But if you go to South America, you can find that species. And then one of the 34 species is a non-native, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. So to figure out why we have the most carnivorous plants, by the way, of all the 50 states. And to figure out why, you have to go back 1.5 million years to the last ice age, which is called the Pleistocene era. And that's when both of the ice caps were really filled with ice. The glaciers were kind of coming down. And this Gulf area kind of provided a refuge for a lot of plants. So the plants up north, they had two choices. One of them was to hope for a random mutation that allowed them to overwinter. And the second was to migrate south. And if you've ever seen a plant migrate, they do it very slowly. So the way that they did it was they released seeds. The ones that happened to go just a little bit further south, they survived. They passed on their traits. The ones stayed up north, froze and died. So during this time, we get about 40 carnivorous plants migrating to the southeast. And then some of the other plants that stayed up there are like conifers that were able to withstand the cold. And the Gulf moderated our temperatures. So we had 4 seasons and a lot of plants enjoy that. All right. To give you an idea of how long ago this was, there was giant ground sloths roaming Tennessee. There was giant 7-foot, 7-inch tall camels roaming the west. And there was this big cat called the Smilodon in central US. Another thing that allowed carnivorous plants to flourish in the southeast was naturally occurring wildfires. And we mentioned this before the talk. This is my one slide about wildfires. So when wildfires come through, they burn the taller shrubs and the trees, and that allows carnivorous plants to get the full sun that they need. So carnivorous plants, all 900 of them, photosynthesize just like any other plant, but they don't do it as efficient. And that's because if you want to photosynthesize, you want to get energy from the sun, you want to have a flat leaf and you want to be facing the sun. But if you think of a fly trap, half of their leaf is upside down. It's facing the wrong way. Or if you think of a pitcher plant, a North American pitcher plant, they're tubes. So none of that is really facing the sun. So when the fire comes through, it gets rid of the things that are blocking the sun. Computer. Good luck. All right. So, Ice Age over 10,000 years ago. Out of the 40 carnivorous plants that migrated down here, only about 5 have been able to migrate back up north. So right now we have a pitcher plant all the way up and down the East Coast. And you can actually find it in Canada over into Michigan. And then we have a couple of sundews that are up and down the East Coast. But what scares scientists is in the past, 10,000 years, only 5 out of 40 have been able to recolonize the East Coast. So what's going to happen if the climate changes faster than it has in the past 10,000 years? Are the plants going to be able to adapt? Sorry, guys. All right. In my book, by the way, we're approaching 2,000 copies sold, which I'm ecstatic. That's the original print number. They're printing more. In the first edition, which is this, you'll have this beautiful picture of a little flock of pitcher plants. This picture was taken in Volusia County, which is kind of near Florida. And the caption reads, if you're looking for, in Florida, near Orlando, sorry. It says, if you are looking for carnivorous plants, a great place to find them is underneath telephone lines or power lines, because the mowing mimics the naturally occurring wildfires. It gets rid of the taller shrubs and trees. But the new edition, but it's not really, but the new printing is going to say that this population no longer exists because that county has decided to spray herbicides instead of mowing twice a year. So instead of getting manpower to mow that area twice a year, they decided to spray herbicides, and the herbicide that they used wasn't, it didn't just concentrate on one thing, it killed everything, which is very sad. And the last reason, so we have a lot of sun, and we have those fires to make it for the plants to get a lot of sun. The last reason why we have the most carnivorous plants, here is a map of around the 1700s, and Florida soils are very saturated. And this is a map that the Franciscan monks drew when they were talking to the indigenous people. And the indigenous people said that this peninsula is so wet that you could canoe coast to coast from Tampa south, so halfway to the peninsula south. And that's probably true because the Everglades the river was 8 to 10 feet taller than it is today. And when people came and they saw that, and they saw giant lizards in the waterways swimming around, and they saw orchids and plants that they had never seen before, they said, let's change everything. Let's drain the swamp and let's have everyone be a cotton farmer and a sugarcane farmer. So for early 1800s to the early 1900s, we were trying to drain the swamp. In 1904, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, he ran and won the governorship of Florida with the motto, water will run downhill. He promised everyone that they could be farmers. At the same time, Frank Stoneman, he's the editor of the Miami Herald, the newspaper that still exists, which is pretty remarkable. He said that, yes, Florida is a wasteland, but it's going to be too much money, too much time, too much energy to try to drain Florida. So he really argued with the person who won the governorship. At the same time, Aman Jennings, she was looking at those really rare orchids, those really giant lizards. And here you can see she's probably wearing an endangered or an extinct bird feather, but she really liked Florida's wilderness. And she said, if we start saving parts of Florida, we could have up to 1,000 visitors a year. And today we have 1,000 people moving to Florida a day. And she's nicknamed the mother of Florida forestry because she was able to establish some of the first state parks. Minnie Moore Wilson, she was talking to the Miccosukee and the Seminole tribes, and she really liked how they lived sustainably. She liked how they lived with nature, and she thought that more of us should replicate how they lived. And then many years later, 1947, we get a woman signing a book, and she is quoted as saying, "It is a woman's business to be interested in the environment. It's an extended form of housekeeping." And that woman is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And she is the daughter of Frank Stoneman, the person who said that Florida is a wasteland. And she went over to the Everglades and she studied it for 5 to 7 years. And she wrote a book in 1947, which is what she's signing. And a few months later, the National Everglades Park was established because of that book. And of course, you worked together establishing that book. And then remember, this is 1947. In 1969, she had to establish the Friends of the Everglades because people were trying to build an international airport inside the Everglades. Yes. So why do we mention all those people? Because today the Everglades host 1 out of 3 of the state's carnivorous plants. The other third are in the Panhandle, and then the other third are all throughout the state. And without those people, we wouldn't have these endangered plant species, which are all carnivorous. And I just want to remind you that diversity in species and who is in power is a benefit. So those women saw tourism and plants as a benefit, where a lot of those guys were like, oh, we could just grow cotton because that's what we know. All right. So the rest of the presentation is actually about the carnivorous plants. In this past May, I went to Japan for the International Carnivorous Plant Society's conference. This year is Vienna, Austria. And there's 900 plants that we could say eat flies. So it could be a little confusing if you say fly trap, and you have people from Japan and Australia and Germany and Switzerland, right? And we had South Americans, we had everyone. So in the book I mentioned, I have like 2 pages about why scientific names are really important. So most of the book, I refer to them as by their scientific name. This is a Venus flytrap, you probably knew that. The scientific name is Dionaea muscipula. Muscipula means mouse trap. So you can imagine 200 years ago, when the people from the Carolinas, they were out in the fields, they were looking at this and they said, yeah, it kind of hinges like a mouse trap. So we're going to send it to Linnaeus and we're going to say the genus or the species is muscipula. And the way that they came up with the genus is back then, unfortunately, it was only guys who got to be naturalists and biologists. And you can imagine they were lonely. They were out there in the woods for months at a time. And when they looked at this plant, they said it reminded them of a female anatomy. So they named it after Dionaea, which is one of the 4 Greek goddesses. And these Greek goddesses are the goddesses of love, beauty, sex, and romance. Come on. There you go. So, yeah, I don't see it either, so I'll move on. All right, in the entire world, there's only a 60-kilometer radius of where Venus flytraps are native to. But they're in my book. And that is because in 1972, somebody planted them in the panhandle of Florida. And the area is about maybe 2 of these rooms. And the person who planted them published that they planted them about 2 years ago. So they actually said, yes, we spread the seeds and we spread the rhizomes. So they've been in Florida for 52 years. We call them a non-native because they haven't spread. And they get frozen back every year. They get eaten by bugs. So they're not invasive, but they are a non-native. The way that a Venus flytrap works is that inside their lobes, they have 2 lobes on each leaf. They have 2 to 4 trigger hairs. If you or a bug touches one of those trigger hairs, a little calcium action potential wave goes up and down. But looking at the plant, nothing happens. But if you or a bug touches that same trigger hair twice within 20 seconds, the calcium action potential wave gets so big, what happens is water moves from the inside of the trap to the outside of the trap. And because there's more water on the outside, it's heavier, and that's why it snaps shut. Then what we learned in the 70s and 80s, if you feed a Venus flytrap like a hot dog or a piece of bologna, they die. And that is because they cannot digest that type of protein. They can only digest chitinase, which is what insects are made out of. And that trigger hair actually has to be touched more than twice. It has to be touched about 5 or 7 times. So if you want to feed it something dead, you have to actually massage the outside of the lobes for about 45 minutes. You can do it, every couple of minutes. But it's a lot easier just to find a bug or have them outside. The more the animal struggles, or the more you massage your Venus flytrap, you have a lot of time on your hands, the tighter the seal becomes, and the more digestive enzymes the plant pumps into that set of lobes. Each trap can only digest 3 times, and then it turns black and it dies. But here we have 2 perfectly healthy plants. This is one plant. This has 20 leaves, right? So that means it can eat 60 times because each leaf can eat 3 times. But the idea is every time they eat, they get nutrients and then they grow a new leaf. So they should be going on for many, many years. They're supposed to live about 15 to 20 years. And then you get seeds after they're about 3 or 4 years old. And then you can also divide them by rhizome. The next group are the North American pitcher plants, the Serenoa. There is one that's over in California, so I shouldn't mention it. This is the Serenoa genus of North American pitcher plants. And in the book for all of the natives, I have distribution maps, so that's what you see here. We have 7 different types of pitcher plants. And the way that they work is they have some nectar underneath their lid. And that nectar has a chemical called choline. And it's the same chemical as poison hemlock and poison ivy. But if you're a tiny bug, it makes you drunk and it makes you intoxicated. And then they fall down the well The well has some digestive enzymes. It takes them 2 weeks to 2 months to eat their food. And if a big animal like a frog or a spider goes in there, what they do is they actually steal the plant's food and they just crawl back out because the plant is not that strong. All right, so here's the different types of pitcher plants that we have in the state of Florida. These are close to the panhandle. We have subspecies, which means that the original species is separated by such a distance that it can't mate with these guys. So we have Serenoa rubra subspecies golfensis, which means we have this plant on the Gulf and the rest of the rubras are on the Atlantic. So there's like a big distance. Same with Alabamanensis, that's found in Alabama, but then there's a big swatch of emptiness. And then we have a subspecies. And then we have flava. We have lots of varieties of flava. Flava means yellow, so they have a yellow flower. This is maybe my second favorite picture of the book. You can see that ring of nectar on the top. So if you're a wasp, you can see like this giant landing pad. You see like a free snack, but then you get drunk and then you fall in. So these are different types of flava. You can see they have some like pretty veins, like purple veins, black veins. But then this is also the same species, just a different variety, but it's solid green with a little bit of red in the throat. Leucophylla means white top. And what's cool about this is they have a lot of hairs underneath their lid. So when they're drinking nectar, if they don't feel great about going into this well, they'll try to back up, but the hairs poke them and encourage them to go further down. And then for this species, they have all these little white areoles and sun goes through here. So scientists think that the bug feels pretty confident going further down because they're like, oh, look at all these open doors that I could leave at any time. But then they turn out to be closed windows and then they die. The next species is Serenoa minor. This is our southernmost native pitcher plant. This one comes down to Tampa over to Orlando, and I brought some hybrids of it over there. You remember all of the other lids were kind of open and quite a bit of space. This one is minor, so it has this kind of hooded, menacing look to it. This was the first pitcher plant discovered by Europeans in 1537. And then in 1887, it was discovered that this was a carnivorous plant. So it took them over 250 years to figure out that it was carnivorous. And the second to the last one is Psittacina. These are interesting because you can see them floating down mats of sphagnum moss on rivers. So they really like it very soggy. I have a couple hybrids of this with me. They're decumbent. So whereas the other ones are 12 inches up or 30 inches up, these lie horizontal. And these can eat small tadpoles and fish. And then the last species, this species is only found in the state of Florida. It's called Serenoa rosea. It's named after its flower and not its pitcher. And there's another one that looks very similar to it, except that it has purple flowers. And Serenoa purpurea, that one is found all up and down the East Coast, up into Canada and over into Michigan. And for that species, the one that's not in Florida, over 30 species of organisms breed and reproduce inside the pitcher. So the other ones have lids that prevent rainwater from going in, but this one, their lids are all the way back and they welcome rainwater. And the way that they digest their meal is symbiotic bacteria, just like how we have bacteria in our gut. So because it's not like a really strong digestive enzyme, protozoa all the way up to flea and midges and mosquitoes and different types of caterpillars breed and grow up in there. So I hope you're thinking, wow, those are some really sexy Serenoa. And I agree with you, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Here we have 3 naturally occurring hybrids that you can find in the state of Florida. And that is because pitcher plants are promiscuous. They will have sex with anything that is near them. And here we have a list of all of the naturally occurring hybrids that you can find in the state of Florida or neighboring states. So Notho species just means like it's a simple cross. And if you, let's say your last name is Moore and you find a plant that looks a little different, you might want to name it after yourself. So that is why all of these have names. People thought they were their own species. They named it after themselves. One of them was named after their friend's wife, which is kind of strange. And then through DNA, we learned that these are actually all just naturally occurring hybrids. And to figure out why they are so promiscuous, you have to look at their sex organs, which of course are their flowers. And if you dissect a pitcher plant flower, this is what it looks like. And the way that they're pollinated by bees and bumblebees and wasps. And what that bug would do is they would go underneath one of the 4 drooping sepals, and then they're going to go up and over that structure, and then they're going to run around this upside down umbrella, and they're going to drink nectar. And then when they're doing that, they're going to accidentally pick up some pollen that has been very conveniently caught by this upside down umbrella shape. And then when they leave, they only have 4 choices to parachute out. And then when they go to the next flower, which is 1 foot away or 100 feet away, they're going to repeat this process. And like in my introduction, I was a middle school teacher for 7 years. If you remember 7th grade biology class, when pollen and stigma come together, you get fertilization. So when the little bees are doing this process again, when they go up and over this structure, they're going to scrape the pollen off from the last flower onto that stigma. And these plants have 4 or 5 stigma, and that's how you can make a hybrid, or that is how the bugs do it on accident. In the book, at the last page, or the last 2 pages of each chapter, I have a list of commonly cared for carnivores, or like commonly occurring hybrids made out of native species, or just the native species themselves. The next group is Utricularia. That scientific name means wine flask, leather pouch, or bagpipe. So you're probably thinking these are going to look pretty cool. And you're right. They look like that. They kind of look like pond scum. And around the world, there are about 220 species. Some in the state of Florida, we have fully aquatic ones. And then we also have some that are in the soil. But in South America and Central America, there are some that are epiphytes. So they can be found hanging up in the trees like an orchid. If you look at their traps very closely, this is what it looks like. And these are the fastest carnivorous plant in the entire world. They close in about 1/1000th of a second, and a Venus flytrap closes in about 1/10 of a second. They have these little hairs in front of their bladder, and when they're triggered, a door opens inward. And when they open inward, a little vacuuming effect occurs. So they like suck up their prey, but they also might suck up some water or some soil. And then they kind of push out everything except for the prey. And they usually digest their prey in about 20 minutes because they're eating tiny things and their bladders are tiny. So this is, if you have an aquatic species, they actually might eat mosquito larvae. And there's like one very, very, very bad video on YouTube that's like 7 seconds long, but it does show a little mosquito larvae being stuck in there. They're also known to eat maybe some tadpoles. If they eat something big like a mosquito larvae that's bigger than the trap, what they do is they just kind of grab a hold of whatever they can and they'll digest that. And then they eat the next bit. So they kind of just do it in little increments. And as a lifelong vegetarian, I think that's fascinating. So here we have a beautiful picture of an aquatic bladderwort that you can find definitely in Tampa. And you can see it has this really long, beautiful yellow flower on a scape. Does anyone see the other plant in the picture? So there's maybe a county park near me. It's called Violet Curry Park. And you can find both of these species in the waterways. You can also find a handful of sundews. Maybe, I haven't seen it, but you might be able to find one of the butterworts because it comes down. But this, so in the state of Florida, we have 14 different types of bladderworts. Half of them are aquatic, half of them are terrestrial. 11 of them are yellow, and we only have one that's white. And it only blooms for maybe 4 to 6 weeks a year. So when it's blooming, you're going to have to look for a flower that's that big. And if it's not blooming, you're going to just have to look for that tiny little green squiggle floating around in the waterway. Here we have 2 other species of aquatic bladderworts. And you might be thinking like, well, why isn't that the baby of the other one? And that's because scientists have decided to separate them because one of them has more floating arms than the other. But the problem is one of them has 4 to 7 floating arms and the other one has 5 to 10 floating arms. So you can't just count the arms. So the other way to do it is one of them has a cylindrical floating arm and the other one has a T. And this is how we divide text. We do taxonomy. So like I mentioned, we have 11 yellow bladderworts. In the book, I have a 2-page spread that says like, are you watching a bladderwort from the water? Is it on land? Okay, no, then you go to here. Does it have floating arms? Does it have like lobes? Does it have like a horn? We historically had 3 pink, purple bladderworts. The picture in the center on the bottom, that's the one that's extirpated. It probably went extinct about 15 to 20 years ago because we decided to build like a housing development on the last known site of it. So now you have to go to Brazil to find it. And we do have, still we have 2 pink species. The next group are the pinguiculas, which means like the buttery ones or the greasy ones. And you can see these are a little bit more widespread throughout Florida. They work like fly paper. So their leaves are sticky and they eat tiny things like fruit flies, fungus gnats. And these species are found in higher elevation than the next that I'm going to show you. So that means these can be all the way up to 10 feet above sea level. You can find these in like a pine woods forest. And we have lots of different colors. Like lutea comes in white or yellow. Pumila is tiny. The traps themselves are only about that big. And then we're getting a little lower in elevation. So you can see Pinguicula planifolia. They can be underwater during the summer rainy season. And what's cool about them is they can still trap and digest organisms when they're underwater. And this is in a different presentation, but because that they're sticky underwater, the medical industry has looked into it and they've made sutures that dissolve inside the body based off of the sundew and the butterwort, because it's the only natural glue that is still sticky underwater. And then the last species I think that we're going to talk about is Pinguicula primuliflora, which means they have like primrose like flowers. And those are the species that I brought with me today. They're the easiest. A couple of the species that I mentioned earlier are endangered, so it's hard to move them and sell them. This is the easiest species. The adults, each plant can get 6 to 8 inches. And then at the tip of each of their arms, they have 2 to 4 little pups that you can pluck off and you can put in a different pot or a different area of your garden. And they have pretty flowers. They're all about to flower probably in the next week or 2. And this is my favorite photo in the book. It shows a clear water stream. That's their common name. You can see they're kind of like colonizing this little mud island, and they're vegetatively propagating. So they're just kind of running around this mud island. The next group are the sundews, Drosera, which means they're like the sun worshippers. And I should mention that just because they're native doesn't make them a good candidate for your backyard. So a lot of the Sarracenia that are just species are prone to root rot. They don't do well in a pot. You'd have to have like a really large structure so the roots don't get too hot, especially this far south. And then some of the butterworts and some of these sundews, they only live for 1 or 2 years and then they'll seed themselves to death. So if you don't harvest the seeds, you'll lose your population. Brevifolia and capillaris, they're very tiny, maybe the size of like a dime to the size of a quarter. And then the next one is Drosera intermedia. They're a little bit bigger. They like intermediate conditions. You can see they can be fully saturated in the water, or they could be a little drier. They're called sundews because when they're exposed to a lot of light, they become dewy, and that dew attracts the bugs. They think it's a water source, but instead of a water source, it's glue. and then they get trapped on the leaves, and then they get dissolved through the leaves. The next one is Drosera filiformis. This can be found up and down the East Coast, but we have a special variety called Floridiana. It's a little bit more red and orange than the other ones. And then the biggest species that we have in the state of Florida is Tracei. Both filiformis and Tracei are only found in the Panhandle. This species can get about 16 to 20 inches tall, and these are all green, whereas the previous species I showed you is red and orange. And all of the sundews that I mentioned, they have these really big flower scapes like this one, and they'll have a pink flower. They'll have one pink flower every day for about 7 to 10 days. You don't have to do anything, but if you have a lot of time, you can get a paintbrush and you can just rub it for, a second or two. And the flower opens for one day and closes, and then you get the next one. You don't really have to do anything, and you'll end up with 50 to 200 seeds, and then you can just surface sow them, and you can have more sundews. You can have a little army of fruit fly and fungus gnat eaters. And the last species that can be found in the state of Florida is a carnivorous bromeliad. There's 2,500 species of bromeliads, and only as of today, 3 of them are considered carnivorous. Unlike most bromeliads, the 3 species, like to live in full sun. They require full sun. If you are growing them correctly, they'll be very tight and very straight up. If you're growing them incorrectly, as in not enough sun, they're kind of floppy and their leaves kind of go out. So they need full sun. They have this white powder that prevents insects from seeing UV light. They collide into it, and then they have symbiotic bacteria that helps break them down. All right. There is 268,000 species of plants that flower around the world. And I told you there's about 900 species of carnivorous plants out of that section. And the International Union of Conservation of Nature, out of 268,000 species of plants, they have looked at 3%. And they've done studies on 3% of everything we know. And of that 3% that they've looked at, they have said that 70% of everything we've looked at for plants is vulnerable to extinction, endangered, or critically endangered. So we're not doing very good. And why do we care about that? In today's presentation is because carnivorous plants are disproportionately more endangered and more threatened than non-carnivorous plants. The biggest problem for sundews is agriculture activities like pesticides and herbicides. The biggest problem for pitcher plants, the North American pitcher plants, and this is in order, the biggest problem is natural system modification, us making housing developments in cul-de-sacs. And in order to do that, we have to drain and we have to move the soil. So we're moving the waterways. The next one is invasive species. This includes wild hogs, digging them up, but it also includes the Asian climbing ferns and air potatoes. They're, colonizing trees and they're blocking the sun. And then the next one is pollution. And David Jennings from the University of South Florida would like to remind you that insecticide use above, within, or below the recommended treatment level can be harmful to carnivorous plants. So if your neighbor is spraying their yard and killing the bugs, when the native birds are eating those poison bugs, or our carnivorous plants are eating those poison bugs, it is not great for the ecosystem. And then the last one is the bladderworts. Their biggest problem is pollution, specifically the too many fertilizer in the waterway. Now it's in many counties and all over, so in many counties, you're not allowed to apply lawn fertilizer for 6 months of the year. And it's a Florida state law that you're not allowed to apply fertilizer if the forecast says it's going to rain in the next 24 hours. So what happens is people fertilize their non-native grass. The fertilizer gets washed away in a rainstorm. It goes into the sewers, then it goes into the river. And then because these plants are in the river, you get algae, and then the plants can't photosynthesize and they can't get their bugs. But then those nutrients go into the ocean, and that's how you get red tide events that kill manatees and the seagrasses and fish and causes us to cough. In around 1950, Aldo Leopold said there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. So he's basically saying some people can be happy working in a 9-to-5 job, you know, an office job, whereas others have to get out there and they have to enjoy nature and go for a hike and enjoy the wilderness. But today we know that we actually all need wild places and wild things. So if we save wild carnivorous plant habitat, we're going to find out more about how the ecosystems work. We're going to learn the plants filter the water, they clean the soil, they clean the air. The swamps and bogs are the biggest carbon sink. They soak up the most carbon. They soak up more carbon dioxide than rainforests. So if we help save them, we're kind of helping save ourselves. So in the book, I mentioned 12 ways that you can help carnivorous plants, but today we're going to talk about 2. The biggest one is educate others about the value of wild habitats. So it's great that we're here, but your neighbor might not know that we have a carnivorous plant in Florida, or that we have the most carnivorous plants, or that we have lots of wild native plants that we should be protecting. And another thing about that, you could be educating them like different ways to be watering their lawns. You know, it makes me so sad when the sprinklers are going off and it's been raining for 2 days. And then the last thing that we'll end on today is how you can help is you can plant natives or non-invasive plants in your yard. So February through May and September through November, every weekend, I am at a plant sale, selling plants in Central Florida. So Orlando to Tampa and kind of Sarasota to Gainesville, I guess. So lots of Central Florida. And I'm specializing in carnivorous plants and ant plants, but other people have house plants, other people have landscape plants, butterfly plants, things like that. And it's surprising on how many people are still able to sell invasive plants, like mother-in-law tongue, like, or, you know, lots of things like that. So we'll just leave it at that. So the rest of the presentation is growing Florida's carnivorous plants. And it's very short because it's very easy. The first thing you need to do is you have to find a baby head down. You will not be able to find one in Tampa because I've gone to all the thrift shops. All right, the first thing you need to do is think about water. All carnivorous plants, I'm making a generality, all 900 species of carnivorous plants need rainwater or distilled water. So city water and well water will kill them. You do not need to experiment. We already know the answer. So you need really pure water because they've evolved for, the bromeliads are the most recent. They've only evolved like 1 million years ago, but most of them have evolved 65 million years. And they've evolved in nutrient, they've evolved in environments that don't really have a lot of nutrients or a lot of stuff happening in the soils. So they cannot handle metals, chlorine, fluoride, anything in well water or city water. So you got to have pure water. And then the other thing for Florida's carnivorous plants or North America's carnivorous plants, which is this side, they need to be sitting in water all the time. They need to be sitting in about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch of water all the time. If they dry, they die. So you have to keep them moist. All right, so here's some examples from my book. If you have a pond with or without fish, you can float them in the pond. You can put them on a little ledge. On the top left is a claw-footed tub that's filled with water, and it has little tadpoles and fish swimming around, but the lava rock is kind of a little bit exposed and the plants are growing out of the lava rock. And then the bottom, or the 2 pictures on the right, show also claw-footed tubs, but they're filled with a substrate. And you can use half peat and half perlite, or you can use half sphagnum moss and half perlite. Peat moss is not sustainable. It takes about 10,000 years for sphagnum moss to decompose and turn into peat. And then we dredge it up and we sell this giant bale for $10. But what's happening is we're running out of swamps to dredge up. And the other thing is, if you want to grow carnivorous plants, that's where the wild carnivorous plants are found. So it's kind of silly to be using that substrate for your plants at home when that's where the wild plants are growing. So in Tampa, I have some live sphagnum. I don't think I have any pots with it today, but I start with like a 4-inch square. I put it in a kiddie pool And by the end of the summer, the entire kiddie pool is filled with live sphagnum. So you can plant the plants in the live sphagnum, or you can let it get a couple of inches deep and then the bottom layers die and you can use that. But so sphagnum moss is sustainable. What I'm using is coconut core or coconut chips. So everyone around the world eats coconuts, South Americans, people from Africa, people from Asia. And you're just eating the inside of the coconut. So we have all these coconut husks. So for hundreds of years, African countries and Asian countries have been chopping up the husk and using it for gardening. And I think we should be doing that too. The Europeans and the North Americans, we've been dredging up the swamps to use peat, but that's a good alternative. And then during the pandemic, a college student in the Midwest, he started making this product, which is called pit moss. It's a pre-consumer paper product. So if you've ever bought a cardboard box, you know that there's like a skinny rectangle missing on each corner, because that's how you fold it. So what he did was he took all of those skinny rectangles and he shredded it, and it kind of looks like guinea pig bedding or hamster bedding, and it is a peat alternative. It's called pit moss. You cannot just use that because it's very heavy, but if you use perlite, which is volcanic rock, and pit moss, you could use that as a substitute. Florida's carnivorous plants, North America's carnivorous plants need full sun. They are not really great as house plants. They need to be outside. If you can grow a tomato in that area, then you can grow those carnivorous plants. So they need full 8 hours of sun or even more. The more sun you give them, the brighter red and the prettier they become. All right, so that's my book, Florida's Carnivorous Plants. But I actually don't specialize in Florida's carnivorous plants. I specialize in these, which are the tropical pitcher plants. And these are from mostly Southeast Asia. All of these turn into 6 to 8 foot long vines. So the plants I brought, some of them are big, some of them are a little smaller, younger. All of these will turn into a 6 to 8 foot long vine. Some of them will be as big as your chest or your torso. Some of them stay the size of a golf ball. The people who are at home, if you can see my mouse, the pitcher that has the finger that's holding the little green pitcher plant, that one I really like because it is a vegetarian carnivorous plant. It used to eat bugs, but in the past, I forgot, we'll say 1,000 to 10,000 years, it has stopped eating bugs, and now it just eats falling leaves. So you can say it's a cannibal, or you can say that it eats plants. So it cannot digest insects anymore. It's digesting leaves. And my other favorite is the one in the top center that is red, that has some fangs. And I have some merchandise that has that. Those are my favorite. I want to be known for those. They require 70 degrees and above at all times. So that means that's a greenhouse plant. But my favorite thing about them is they have fangs, unlike anybody else, and their fangs drip nectar. So it looks like they're drooling. And I mentioned that these plants, the tropical pitcher plants, they turn into 6 to 8 foot long vines. That one turns into like a 30 foot long vine. And the leaves are very large. The pitchers are maybe that big, maybe half the size of a head, but they're my favorite. And in 2 years, I will have 8 hybrids of it at least. When they flower, it looks like dandelion seeds, like tiny little flying seeds. You sow them, 6 weeks later, you get a little baby, maybe like a quarter size of a penny. 2 little leaves come up, and they already have pitchers, but they're quarter size, eighth of a size of a penny. And then you wait about a year, and you have a plant that's the size of a quarter. And then you wait another year, and you have a plant that you can put in like a 3-inch hanging basket. And then they grow fast because they have big pitchers, they can be eating a lot of stuff. These ones are a little different. You're going to grow these like an orchid. So you're going to grow them in the same substrate as the other ones, but instead of full Florida sun, you're going to grow them in bright indirect light. You can have those inside or outside. And here's just a selection. I didn't bring all of these, of course. I have about 70 different hybrids or species in my nursery. And some of them have purple leaves, some of them are all red, they have big mouths, little mouths. Yeah, and with that. Thank you, everyone, for coming to tonight's presentation. So I can take a couple of questions. And then I have to do my sales pitch because that's how I make a living. The first question always is, are they safe for cats? And then question number like 17 is, are they safe for small children? And the answer to both of those is yes. So they just have nectar. The tropical pitcher plants that I was mentioning earlier, and definitely in Thailand, but in some other Southeast Asian countries, they actually rinse out the pitcher and they fill it with minced meat and minced vegetables and rice. And you pop it in your mouth. And it's like a little hors d'oeuvre. And has anyone ever eaten a cranberry hibiscus? Okay, it tastes like a Sour Patch Kid. It's really sour. That's what the pitchers taste like. So they are actually edible. All right, does anyone have questions? And all the plants come with a care sheet.
So they're not all natives. You said that's what I wanted to clear.
Yeah, so over here, we have all of the butterworts are natives. These are hybrids of the natives. And then down here, we have some more hybrid Sarracenia. And we have sundews that are native. So this section is native. The fly traps, I've been here for 52 years, 53 years, so you can make your own decision on that. And then these are the exotics. Yes.
I've always heard that they developed that habit because they lived in infertile soil. Is that true?
Yeah, so there's 900 species. They're found everywhere except for Antarctica. And I've been to Iceland and Alaska, and I saw wild carnivorous plants there, and they're living like right in volcanic rock. So yes, generally speaking, that is how they've evolved.
My follow-up question. If you take and you put them in rich soil, does that change their behavior?
Yep, they die. They die. Their roots just kind of melt away. They can't uptake it. So about really up until like 4 years ago, they said like never fertilize a carnivorous plant, but it turned out that we were just kind of like fertilizing them wrong. You don't need to fertilize them. They just need to eat one bug every 6 to 8 months and they're good to go. So you could have a lot of these plants inside your house. If you want to fertilize them, instead of fertilizing the soil, you would be feeding the trap. So you can like put Osmocote fertilizer in some of the traps, or you could go to the pet store and buy beta fish food or mealworms, and you can put those in the traps and they respond remarkably well. They grow very fast. And before I was mentioning I'm breeding my own pitcher plants, I have too many. I literally have like thousands and thousands of seedlings, but if you're doing it as a hobbyist, people literally get a syringe and they fill it up with the seaweed fertilizer. And before the little pitchers open, they literally inject fertilizer into the pitchers to get them to grow fast. Yes, you have a question? So the reason why those pitchers are so large is because we did not allow them to eat bugs for a while. And that's kind of true for everything. These, you saw in the slideshow that the pitcher plants were like really pretty and colorful. These just came out of a greenhouse. Once you put them outside with a little bit of sun, they will color up. And they're gonna get really colorful because they need to attract bugs. Before they were in the greenhouse and they're having a good life, getting a little bit of fertilizer to get them this size. So when they don't get a lot of bugs, they kind of put on a show to attract the bugs. And the pitcher plants, because it's so early in the season, that's why they look like that. Maybe come June, after the pitchers are filled with like love bugs and sometimes like spiders and beetles and flies, the next set of pitchers are not as colorful because they've kind of got enough nutrients to make them out. So when they don't get a lot of bugs, they attract it, and then when they're satisfied, they kind of slow down in their color.
You said they got big, so how did they get big?
We just didn't give them access to bugs in the greenhouse. We didn't fertilize them. And they were just like, oh, I need to keep getting bigger and more colorful so I can attract the bugs. Any other questions? Allison, do we have any questions from Zoom? Okay.
Can you explain these plants you brought
Yes.
in? You tell-
Yeah. So this is how I make a living, so I have to tell you my little sales pitch. These North American hybrids, there's two different types. They're $10 each. I have a couple of different flytraps here and the native butterwort, some more pitcher plants, and then if you look down here, there's like a flytrap with a native sundew and different sundews. This whole section's $10. This is metal art of a pitcher plant. It's $15. The metal Venus flytraps are 20. These flytraps, they're older. They're about 2 years old. They're $15. And then these big sundews, these are from South Africa. And unlike our native ones, which die back every winter, most of our native stuff dies back from Thanksgiving to Valentine's Day. This sundew that's from South Africa is a really good house plant. It's a good windowsill plant. And unlike our native species, when a bug lands on it, it actually wraps around the food. It takes about 45 minutes for it to wrap around. And so you can watch it, you know, you can check on it every 5 minutes or so. The native ones, the bug just lands on it, gets stuck, and nothing happens. It just gets dissolved over the course of a week or so. I brought hats, t-shirts, and my book. They're $20, or if you buy two, they're 2 for $30. Then you can mix and match. And I signed all the books. And this is my third book. This is my first book that was published by a real publisher. The first 2 books I self-published, which means you cannot donate them to a library or a school. But because this one was actually published by Pineapple Press, which historically has been in Sarasota, you can donate it to a school or a library. And then I have different sundews here. These are also the African ones, but I have some anthocyanin-free ones, which means they lack pigment. They're all green. And then the ones up front are red. Those are 15. And then we have some pitcher plants here. This one is the one with the fangs, if anyone's interested in that. I have stickers that I designed. There's 6 stickers. You get 3 stickers for $5. 5 of them are Florida natives. And the one that's not a native is the one that has the fangs, because that's what I want to be known for. So I'm trying to get the legacy out now. And then these huge ones are $40. And over here is my new passion. I've had these as like growing, you know, in my backyard for maybe 10 years, but now I'm propagating them. This last section are called ant plants. And unlike carnivorous plants, ant plants kind of do the opposite. They provide homes for ants. So there's about 100 species of ant plants. There's one, I think only one orchid. And there's trees that are ant plants. These are all epiphytes. What they do is they have these huge caudexes. Some of them will, some species, their caudix, the base will be bigger than your head. And they're an epiphyte, so they attach themselves to a tree. They naturally make holes and tunnels inside the caudix. And each ant plant has its own ant species. So in Asia and Australia, where these are native to, each has their own ant species that moves in to the bottom, to the base of the plant. And when they move in, they notice that inside this caudix, there's already chambers and tunnels and tubes. So they go, oh, it's like an ant farm. So if you were to dissect it, it would look like an ant. Do not do that. But if you get a little sunburn and like a hole, you can see that it looks just like an ant farm. The ants move in, they go to the bathroom in there, so they fertilize the plant. They bring their food in, the food decays, it fertilizes the plant. So the ants are happy because they get a home. The plant's happy because they're getting nutrients, but then the plant's doubly happy because if the plant is being nibbled on by like a tree kangaroo or something like that, or like a rat, the ants come out and attack that animal. So then everybody's happy. It's a win-win situation. These you grow just like a orchid. You can mount them. I have one in a teak wooden basket, and it used to have like 3 inches of moss or coconut chips. But I've had it for so long, all of it's like gone, and it's just sitting on the wooden basket and it's happy. The other cool thing is I have one species that's flowering. It has these really tiny little white, you see right there, tiny little white flowers sticking off to the side. And that's it. That's what the flower looks like. The cool thing about this group of ant plants is that they're pollinated by the ants just running up and down protecting the plant. So they just accidentally rub up and down and grab the pollen and they're fertilizing. This species, this base is prickly. It gets about that big, but it gets very long. It gets like 18 to 24 inches long. So it'd be like this long cylindrical shape. These guys are called, the species is called puffy eye. They're like little puff balls. So you're gonna grow like an orchid.